Welcome everybody. This is the second class for 3ds Max. I'm Mark Gerhard, and today we're going to be looking at the basics of modeling techniques. So I'm going to actually move this off screen here, and we will get started. Last week we covered a bunch of real basics of the interface, but today I want to dive into more really fundamental things about how to use Max. And I'm going to go slow because if you miss the fundamentals, then you really can't move quickly in Max. Once you have the fundamentals under your belt, then you can do all kinds of wonderful things. So the first thing I want to look at is primitive objects. If you go to the right-hand side of your viewports, there are the command panels, and the panel on the left is called the Create panel. And under the Create panel, there's a row of icons for geometry, shapes, lights, etc. And under Geometry, there's a pull-down here. It's just set to standard primitives. So we did see in last week's class just a little bit about how you do this, but I want to cover this a little more clearly. First thing I'm going to do, and this is what I almost always do when I start, is I check my unit setup. Because I was working on a production job for people in Europe today, my display units are currently set to metric. I'm going to set my display units back to generic. As I mentioned in the last class, generic units really only are used in video games, film, broadcast. In the design viz world, US standard or metric is preferred. There's no reason not to always use these, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use generic units. And this is the default when you open up Max, when it first installs. I'll say OK. And now, under standard primitives, we have a list of standard primitive types here. I'm going to pick a box here. And as soon as I choose box, then the parameters for the box appear in the parameters rollout. And there's a keyboard entry rollout as well. I think I've mentioned that these are called rollouts, and they have a little plus button or minus button for you to make them roll out or roll up. Now, as soon as I choose any particular type of standard primitive object, the parameters for that object appear. Also, down in the lower left here, it gives you a little idea of what to do. So here, this is the status and prompt area. It says click and drag to begin a creation process. Now, if you look at the parameters rollout and watch what happens, I move my mouse over the perspective viewport, which is the current active viewport. I will press, hold my mouse button down and drag. And as I do that, you'll see that the values are changing for length and width. When I release the mouse button and then proceed to move the mouse, now the third dimension is being added. Now, this is something that I want to be very explicit that you understand, that when I click now, immediately, if I don't click again, I have the opportunity to come here and type in values. I can use the tab key to move between these fields. And then I can also use the spinners. I can press and move these like this. I can also click on them to increase in increments. So I can right click on these and it will take it to its lowest possible value. In this case, 0. I'm going to just put in some values that are nice and even here. And let's just let's just make this something about like that, and then even these out. So we'll call this 37, we'll call this 30, and we'll leave it at that. Now, as soon as I click again, these values now are no longer linked to this object. And instead, Max is thinking that you are now ready to make another box. And this is something that you need to understand. This was a design decision made by the Yoast Group early on when they made this product, that they thought that you would want to very quickly be able to make box after box after box, just like this, like I'm making. So because of that, this has to be turned off, and it's not a toggle. If I want to turn it off, I need to either go to the main toolbar and choose something different, or I could go to another of these panels to turn it off. But otherwise, every time I click, thereafter, I will be making another box. So you need to understand that, because if you're just learning the software by sort of poking around at it and you don't understand this, you end up making an awful lot of tiny little boxes that you can't see that just gum up the works. So now let's suppose that I've made, I'm going to undo, Control Z, Control Z, Control Z. I'm back to this box here. And what I want to explain is now, if I want to change the parameters of this box, moving these values here won't do it. So how do I get to those values? Well, the next panel over, the Modify panel, gives me those parameters, which I can now readjust. So I can say, oh, I want this box to be like that, I want it to be like that, I want it to be like that, and I can make the changes there. Anytime you find an object that is a primitive object, and that you want to make changes to it, you can go to the Modify panel, and as long as that primitive object is still parametric, then you can make changes in this way. So I'll say, oh, I want this to be 25, I want this to be 15, I want this to be 26, like that, and there it is. Now, what about these length segments, width segments, height segments? What's going on there? I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that we can see. If I change these right now, you're not really seeing them in the perspective viewport. But if you look in the other views, and I'll hit this button, Zoom Extents All, you can see that in the other views, you're able to see what these segments mean. That's because the perspective view is currently shaded with a realistic shading. If I click where it says realistic and I add edged faces, then I can see what these segments are doing. So I can add height segments, I can add width segments, I can add length segments like this. This is very important for game modeling. You want to have total control over the density of the mesh that you're creating. And if you are unaware of this, then, for instance, if you have it like that, you might think this is just a simple box. But in fact, this is not just a simple box. This is a box with some geometry that's been added. Now, once you have done that, if I now go back here to box, notice that this is a sticky setting. Next time I make a box, it's going to have the same kind of settings. So if I want those to be low, I right-click on each of those, and that'll take me back to the lowest common denominator, the lowest setting that these accept. So in some cases it's 0, in some cases it's 1. Whatever the lowest setting is will happen that way. Each kind of primitive that you make has its own special parameters. So if we look at a cone has a radius 1, it has a radius 2. I'm setting radius 2 now. It has a height. It has height segments. It has cap segments, and it has the number of sides. Each object has its own specific values. Spheres have segments. Geospheres have a different segmentation, a different kind of geometric creation. And they have the options of having it be tetra, octa, or icosahedron. So these are different parametric values. Max is kind of unique in the fact it was one of the very first object-oriented programs that was ever built back in the early 1990s. And so it was one of the first object-oriented parametric programs. Now you'll find that actually most of the time your objects are not going to be parametric because they're going to be collapsed into editable mesh or polygonal objects, poly or edit mesh objects. And we'll get to that shortly. Okay. So undo, undo, undo. Let's see how far back I can go. If I come up here to the quick access toolbar and I choose, click on that arrow, I can see, let's go back that far. And that's about as far as I can go. I'll delete this one. And in fact, I'm going to just kill this guy and make one more box right here. Okay. Now, this one very other important thing that I need to discuss and that you should be aware of, it's just that I've been building these objects in the perspective viewport. When I build them in the perspective viewport, this is the way Max operates, and it's very different than the way Maya, Lightwave, Cinema 4D, I believe, operate, in the fact that Max takes its orientation for the object off of the viewport that you create in it. So in this case, this is the height of the object because it was built in the perspective viewport. Now, if I was to make this box in the front viewport, notice now that if I adjust its height is now what you would think of as its length. This is totally confusing if you don't understand that this is what Max does. And this will drive people crazy who are used to working in other programs that aren't this flexible. I'm not going to defend it and say it's the best way. I'm just going to say this is the way it works. So you should be aware of it. If you open up a file somebody sends you and you have that issue, then this is why it happened. As a rule, I try to build all of my objects in the perspective viewport for this reason. I want my height to be height, just for the sake of my own sanity. Okay, so that's modeling with primitives. There are many different kinds of primitives, and each of these primitives have very unique and different settings to them. I'm not going to go into each and every one of them. In addition to these primitives, if I click here, there's extended primitives, and there's a whole bunch of these too. We'll look at some of those a little bit later on in the class perhaps, but I'm going to go back to standard primitives, and I'm going to talk about one other thing, which is that Max, when we are building in the perspective view, it's not really obvious, but the view is using a grid. And you can see the grid here, which is the default grid, and Max is using that as a construction plane. In the CAD world, they call it a UCS construction. I don't know what UCS stands for. It's a construction plane. So Max has grid settings, and now this is one of those things that I have to remember. Where did grids go? I think in this release they're under Tools, Grids and Snaps, Show Home Grid, Grid and Snap Settings. If I go there, we can see that there's a home grid, and the home grid has grid spacings, It's got a variety of functions here. And in addition, there are user grids. So you can actually make your own grids and use those. And again, whatever grid that you create, then that will be the orientation of the primitive object will be based on that grid. Now, there's one thing for making primitives that I use a lot. So if I was making a box over here like this, I can turn on auto grid. And auto grid will now, as I move my cursor, have a look on my screen here, and you can see that as I move my cursor here, now I'm actually building off of the surfaces that are the planes, the polygons that make up these objects. So if I make a cylinder coming off of here, it can come out like that. Cylinder coming off of here comes out like that. Let's make a box off of the end of this like that, comes out like that. I hope this makes some sense. I think, is it the Alt key? If I hold down the Alt key, then you'll notice that you can actually see that grid now, and then I can continue to use that grid that's been created in an ongoing fashion. That's a very cool feature. Not a lot of people know about that feature. In fact, that can be said about an awful lot of Macs, that people will say, gee, Macs can't do that. Actually, it can. It's just not that many people know about it. Okay, so that's the Auto Grid tool. And one thing that I would like you to do for homework this week will be to play with using, try out all of the standard primitives and see if you can create something with Auto Grid and the standard primitives that, like a robot or anything, that just have some fun with it and get used to it. Now, one other thing that's very important to understand is that some objects, such as a sphere, if I use Auto Grid and I make it here, you'll see that these objects create off of their center. Now that's the default. If I change to edge, I don't think I've ever used this. Let's see what happens. So I have no idea what edge does here. I see. So instead of coming off it wherever you start, it then grows out from that edge. But this is something that drives me a little crazy with some of the objects that you use. You kind of want to use objects that grow off of, that don't grow out of their own center. And each object actually has a pivot point, which is related to this. So you can see in this particular case, let's isolate this. Alt-Q on the keyboard takes you into isolation mode. And looking at this cylinder, you can see that down at the base of the cylinder, when I want to move the cylinder, that its transform gizmo, let me move this there, is at the base of the cylinder. Now if I select a sphere, the transform gizmo is not at the base, but rather in the center. If I go to the Modify panel, I can change base to pivot. So now the pivot point has moved down to the base, to the bottom of the object. And that's another thing to understand about primitive objects, is how they operate in relationship to their pivot point. Okay, so back to basics. Now, I did show this a little bit in class last week, but I want to go over it again in more detail, which is that if I'm making something, I oftentimes will like to, after I make I'm not going to simply make primitive objects stacked on top of each other and that's the end of it. Sometimes I need to do other things to those objects. So the things that you do are called transforms. And there are three basic transforms in Max: move, scale, and rotate. And we looked at this a little bit last week. We're going to look at it again, which is that I can choose them here at the main toolbar. Move, and move gives me a transform gizmo. Scale gives me a different transform gizmo, and rotate gives me a third gizmo. A better way to move objects is to right-click, and then I have the same move, rotate, scale here, but I also have the settings buttons. So if I choose, let's say, rotate right there, then instead of rotating simply like this by eye, I can actually rotate a specific amount by typing in the values. There's always a battle going on in Max between the artist and the designer. What's the difference between an artist and a designer? A designer is a person who wakes up and says, okay, I'm going to make this, I'm going to make that 30 degrees in Y, and I'm going to make it minus 10 degrees in X. And that's what I'm going to do, and then you go do it. An artist is somebody who goes like, oh, look, what's that? Gee, oh, look, I'm going to, oh, hey, I think I'll rotate that like the tail of a dog. I'm going to rotate it about there. So one person approaches it from the left brain, the other approaches it from the right brain. One person approaches it from precision, the other person approaches it from visual, intuitive, creative. The artist has a harder time in this program because the designer actually knows what they did, and when something goes wrong, they can fix it. The artist tends to really have no clue what I did. And I have a degree in art. I'm not a designer, I'm an artist. So I'm inclined to work in that kind of a fashion. And Lance is going, he'll be back. All right. So in any case, the best thing to do when you move objects is to use the settings. And when you rotate objects is to use them in that way. So that you can say, you know what, I want to move this object. I want to move it to this coordinate in space, minus 27, and I'll move it. I'll leave this at minus 27, and I'm going to set this down to Z, to 0 on the Z axis. Let's see where that object ended up, right over there. Now, if I want, I could say, you know what? Let's do it again. I want to move this object exactly 10 units from where it is, or 20 units from where it is. And the type in transform through the settings button lets me do that. I can also get that same button by right-clicking on the main toolbar icons. I can also use the values down here. And I wasn't thinking, and I just did a rotate there. So I'll clear that out like that. Okay, so that talks about move and rotate. Scale is a special case. If you press and drag on this transform, on this toolbar icon, you'll see that we have different kinds of scale values. And I would caution you about being very loose about using scale. The truth of the matter is that if you're making hierarchical objects, if you are making animation with these objects, it's a good idea not to use the scale at this level. And we'll get into this in a moment. Instead, there's a better way to scale things by using modifiers. Why don't I like to use scale here? Well, besides the fact it screws up your animation a lot of the time through hierarchy, there's another reason. Look at this object here, and now look at the values. I'm going to say this is, it's 5 and it's 7, and it's 10. So we get some nice even values there for a second. And now I'm going to decide to scale this up like that. So I've just scaled that nice object, and I come back here and I look at the parameters, and what do I see? It says that it's still 5, 7, and 10. As far as Max is concerned, this is perfectly logical. This is a 5 by 7 by 10 box that's been scaled 390.25%. And if we want to even that out, we'll make it 400%. But as soon as I get rid of that and I save this and I come back in the next day, I don't really know about that scale value anymore. And it's not going to be very clear to me that that's what's happened. So for that reason, that's one of the reasons why I try not to use scale unless I have to. And if I do use scale, I try to use it in conjunction with modifiers rather than something else. Okay, that covers moving, rotating, and scaling objects, I think. That's probably all I need to say about those. But there's other ways that you might want to move an object, and that is to align an object. This is getting to be kind of ugly. I'm going to hit a reset for a second. And I'll make a cylinder here. And I'm going to rotate that cylinder around like this. And then I'm going to make a box with AutoGrid, and I'll make a box on the end of it here. And now I'll make another box over here like this. So, and let's make that box a different color. Okay, make this big so you can see it. So we can also use the Align tool to move objects into place. On the main toolbar, there is a icon over here marked Align. If I press and see that there's a variety of alignment kind of options. But standard alignment is a noun-verb tool. That means that you select the object, then you choose the activity that you want to do. Look down here, and it says pick alignment target object. So I want to align this object to that one. Then I say, okay, I would like to align its X position, its Y position, its Z position. I would also like to align its orientation and say, okay. I could also match its scale. And this is based on the pivot point that I was talking about. So I could say pivot point of the current object to perhaps the maximum of the other object, or the minimum of the other object, or the center of the other object, or the pivot point of the other object. So I'll say that, and I'll use that. So that is the alignment tool. Really useful to know about that. Now there's a new quick align tool, relatively new, but it's been a while since I've used it, so I'm not sure. There it is. Oh, there's align to view as well. So I often will find, let me cancel that for a second, that can be a really interesting way to work. I'll say I want to align this to the view, X, Y, Z, flip it, say okay. So that's another option, the ability to align to view. And there's a lot more hiding in the alignment. This one would align to camera. This one will align highlight. I'm not sure. Let's see. It aligns to a particular normal. There's a lot to look at here. Here's the quick align. Quick align just, I haven't used this in a while, so I have to figure out how to use it. So you say you want to do that, and you say quick align, pick the target object, and it aligns to it without giving you all of that option. So I think it's for very fast working once you're there. Okay, and that's alignment. Now, there's two other things that I want to talk about here, which relates to moving objects and alignment. And let's go ahead and reset for another second here. Save changes. And the very common kind of occurrences. So I think the first thing that I want to explain is that when we move objects, we can also make copies of objects. And there are three kinds of copies that we can make. If I take any kind of transform and hold down the Shift key, so let's take this box and we will call it box A. And then I hold down the Shift key, and now it leaves the original box behind and it creates a clone of that box. The clone has three different object types. It could be a copy, and we'll say this one will be box A, and we'll call it copy. It could be an instance, box A instance, say okay. Or it could be a reference, box A reference, say okay. Let's go into edge mode for a second, edged face mode, so that you can see the difference. Here's the original, here is the copy, here's the instance, and here's the reference. So the point of this is that if I now go to the Modify panel and I proceed to make some change to this object, let's suppose I make it change its width, change its length, change its height like that, you can see that if I make a copy of an object, there's no relationship between the object itself, the copy, and the original object. If I make an instance or a reference, then the objects, the instances, and the references will adopt the changes that occur to the original object. So if I make a number of height segments on it, or if I add width segments or anything like that, it's happening to both the instance and the reference. Now, if I choose the reference, or let's go back and say one more thing, which is if I look here in the Modify panel, and you can see that in the Modify panel that here the box itself is boldface, and here the instance is boldface, and here it's boldface and there's a line that occurs here. So when we get to using modifiers, you will see what this does. I think I will go ahead and go to modifiers right now. Let's do an edit hold. Advanced users in the room or beginner users in the room, there is something in Max called hold, which is a hold buffer, which is like a quick save. So if I choose hold, and then let's suppose I get rid of all these objects, if I come back here and choose fetch, it brings back, hello, suddenly decided to, there it is, okay. That was a little V-Ray bug that seemed to be there. I was working on V-Ray files this afternoon, but I don't have V-Ray on this machine. So that's what that was about. But in any case, hold and fetch is a good thing to do. Control H and Alt Control F are the keyboard alternates. So now that I've done a hold here, I'm going to get rid of some of these and then we'll bring them back in a minute. Now what I would like to talk about is introduction to modifiers. So you've seen making objects, you've understood how you can go to the modifier panel and you can make adjustments to the object. But now the part comes that is really some of the most fun that is in Max, and that is the idea of modifier. There's a modifier list here, and if I choose that drop-down list, I can see a long list of different kinds of objects that can modify this particular object. This list is context sensitive. So if I make a different sort of object, let's say I'll make a line, and then go to the Modify panel. Well, it's not going to be very obvious to you, but these are modifiers that can only be applied to a line. Let's just see if I can show you this real quickly. If I use a helper object, and I make a dummy, and then I go to the Modify panel. Well, no. Well, it's not very obvious, but in fact, whatever will be there, sooner or later, I'll find something that'll be empty because you can't apply any modifiers to it. In any case, let's get rid of these for a second here. So with this box in place, I'm going to start to apply some modifiers to it. So I'm going to first apply a bend modifier to it. Better yet, let's apply a taper first. So here we have a taper modifier. And now, with the taper modifier in place, I can change the parameters of the taper modifier to adjust the geometry. This is a box that has then been tapered. Let's get rid of the taper and let's apply a bend modifier. I can move my mouse over this list, hit the B on the keyboard, and it takes me to the first entry that has a B, which happens to be bend. Now, if I apply a bend modifier to this box, zoom in on this for a second. Something's wrong here. You see this little orange gizmo, that's the term. It's the gizmo for the bend modifier, but the object doesn't seem to bend. We can go back down the stack to the bottom to the parameters of the box, and we can proceed to add some height segments to it. And if I add enough height segments to it, now that bend will become useful. So modifiers work, but they have to have sufficient geometry to work on. If there's no geometry for them to work on, they're not going to do much of anything. But if there's enough geometry for them to work on, then you're going to get some very interesting effects. Modifiers are unique to Max. You don't find this paradigm, I think, in other programs. They can be very awkward to work with if you're not understanding what they're all about. But if you do understand them, they're the equivalent of a construction history in Maya in a very different way, because they are sort of a nonlinear construction history. So if I now go ahead, I can actually take that bend modifier and I can turn it off. So it's still there, but by clicking this little icon there, I've turned it off. Now let's go and let's do one other thing. I'm going to go back down the stack, and then I'm going to add another taper. This time I'll add that taper. And I forgot to turn my cell phone off. So I'll just turn that off. And we will go ahead and I will choose the taper. And now what I want to do is, if I turn the bend on, you'll see that if I play with the taper, that this is a box that has been tapered and then bent. I can similarly take the bend and drag it down, and now, check it out. This is now a very interesting sort of thing. This is an object that's been bent first and then tapered. Let's add another modifier to it. Let's add a twist modifier. Here's an object that has been bent, then twisted, then tapered. Let's take the twist and put it down at the beginning. And now we have something really wacko. Put it back down the way it was. So by using modifiers, you can come up with all sorts of interesting abilities to model inside of Max. That you really don't have that sort of flexibility in other programs. And this is an extremely powerful thing because you can keep these live. So that if you want to change your mind, if you want to hand it to somebody and they go like, oh, well, this needs more geometry, well, they can just apply more geometry. Oh, I don't like the way the twist goes. I would like it to be twisting just a little bit. I don't like that bend. I want the bend to be in a different direction. So all those things are possible. Not only that, but if we go and open these up, you'll find that there's parameters inside or sub-objects inside. So I can take the gizmo and select the gizmo, and then I could proceed to rotate that gizmo or move that gizmo to create a different effect. All that's possible inside of Max. Taper gizmo. Maybe I want to rotate that taper gizmo so it's completely opposite. It's very flexible and gives you a lot of options for creativity. The other thing that's really unique about Max and modifiers is that everything in Max is animatable. So I can turn auto key on. I can then proceed to go, let's start with, let's see, go down to the bend and give it a 0, and the twist and give it a 0, and the taper and give it a 0. Okay, so there's my box. At frame 25, we will have the, let's also animate the width of the box and make it like that. The box comes down like that at frame 25. And then let's have the box twist. And let's have the box taper. And let's have the box bend. Let's play the animation that I just created. So Max is extraordinarily flexible in this ability to animate any parameter. Virtually any parameter can be animated. This gives you all sorts of strange options. I can even animate the number of segments in the box. This will drive your game engines crazy. There's really no, Max can do all sorts of things within Max, but if you are limited by what you want to export to game engine, you got to stop thinking so creatively and be more of a designer, game designer. But it's a lot of fun. I mean, especially if you're just doing cutscenes or you're just doing stuff that's going to stay inside of Max, then sky's the limit there. Okay, I'm thinking that this might be a good time to take a quick 5-minute break. Nelson, are you there?
Yeah, I was. Okay. I was about to suggest the same thing. 2 questions did.
Or 10-minute?
Yeah, a 10-minute break. 2 questions just came in that I can go ahead and talk about once we get back.
Okay, we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Alrighty. And we are back. So we have 2 questions that came in. One is, why does the twist start at frame 0 rather than frame 25? It's prior keyframe.
Exactly. Very, very, very good question. And that is that the way Max operates is that, let me make another object here to demonstrate this. And you might have seen this you might not have spotted this last week because we did it very much at the last minute. So if I animate anything in Max, Max has this, it's trying to help you out. If I go to Auto Key and I go to frame 25 and I say, I would like to move this object from here to here, then what Max does is it places one key at frame 0 for the original position, and then a new key at frame 25 for the new position. So Max automatically, it thinks it's helping you out. Now, it's not helping you out if you're a Maya animator or a soft image animator and you're not used to something like that. So, but that's the way Max operates. So similarly, anything that I do to Max, let's suppose I'll add a twist modifier to this guy. And I will twist him around. And I'll also go back and I will add height segments. So those height segments are also being animated from that. Now, if I actually right-click on any of these keys, you'll see that there's a key here for height segments. And if I click on it, it will give me a value. And if I go to the second key, you'll see there's the values there. So that's just the way Max operates. The only caveat or the only exception to that is when you use the character animation system called Character Studio Biped. Biped, because it was a plugin for Max, the plugin developer did not develop it in the same way. They developed it in the same as Softimage or Maya, so you have to specifically set the keys. If you don't, then Max will not set that dual set of keys. And for people who are Maya or Softimage animators, we have a different thing called set key. And in set key, Max does not do that same kind of treatment. So if I come over here and I make a cone, and then I choose set key, if I want to rotate this around like this at frame 30, I choose this big button here, I say set key, and you'll see that it only has that key at frame 30 and it doesn't have the original key. And no animation has really been created. I would need to go there and choose set key, and now this is your basic kind of animation that you're used to from other programs if that's what you've learned. This was added to accommodate animators, professional animators who've come to Max from other programs. Okay, what was the other question?
The other question was, I noticed twist is from the bottom. How would you twist from the bottom, then untwist from the top?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure. I think we could probably do that, and it would be horribly complicated. But if I take this object, and I am going to let's just see what happens. So that object has a twist like that. So what it would be is there's a twist center, and I can animate the twist center. Now this is quite a complex thing. The truth of the matter is I think that would be something that I would probably not be able to pull off very simply in Max. What I would have to, I can show you some of the things that I would suggest, but it wouldn't actually probably work. I can animate the center of the twist. So I can say that at frame, let's say at frame 40, I want to move the center of the twist up to here. And let's just see if that really does animate. And I'll go back here. Oh, I have to have auto key on. So let's see if I come over here and I move this. So indeed, I can animate the center of the twist. And then the other thing that I could do, let's get rid of all these for a second here, is that I could sort of trick it into saying that, all right, at frame 30, that's where the center is. And then at the very next frame, the center is up here. So then the center actually can jump to that place, and then the transforms or the twist will happen from there. More likely, what I would end up doing would be making a copy of the object, one with a twist. I would have to make two copies of the object that had the center in two different places, and then hide one of them, and then the next frame unhide as it would be a trick. That's one of the things that I would, when someone would ask me to do that, I would probably say, that's kind of hard to do in Max. Let's not do that. Actually, the way to do that would be if I really had a director that said, oh, we have to have that, is that I would do all of this, and then I would bake all of this into a vertex animation, so that this would no longer be an animation based on parametric values that are being keyframed, and instead it would really just be the positions of all the vertices shifting around. And then I'd make a clone of that object, and then I would do a second vertex animation, and that would be probably the way that I would make it happen. But not an easy thing to accomplish.
Alrighty.
All right. Okay. So let me go back to my my fetch here, and say fetch OK, and say OK, and we'll open up. So the reason that I'm bringing this back is now you'll remember that we have the original object, the copy of the object, the instance of the object, and the reference of the object. So if I take the original object and I proceed to add a a few modifiers to it, I'm going to add that bend modifier, and I'm going to proceed to bend that object over like this. So you can see that if I put a modifier on the original object, then the instance and the reference will do the same. Now, if I choose the instance of the object and I add a modifier to it, I'm going to add the twist to it, and I will have that object twist around. You can see that it doesn't matter whether I'm doing the original or whether I'm doing the instance. They are exactly the same. It's like Superman's, and what were they, androids. He had these androids in his closet. They were exactly the same. It's the same, so it doesn't matter. Now, on the other hand, actually, let's go back and make this so it's not so drastic, just very slight. And then if I choose the reference has this heavy gray line. And with that heavy gray line, if I apply a modifier above that gray line, taper, and I'll add a curve to it, notice that that is only being applied to the reference object. Now, if I actually drag that down here, then now it gets applied to the others. If I drive it above there, then it's only applied there. Why is this something that's really important to understand? When you're working in Max, you have to be a little bit of a fortune teller. So I did a lot of design viz in my life, and I remember I was working on a building of a hospital, and there were several hundred windows that I was placing in this hospital. And I made each of the windows just individual objects. And then the next day, the architect came in and he said, oh, we're changing all those windows from, 2 foot wide to 3 foot wide. And then I had to spend another day replacing each of those. If I had been smart enough to make all those objects instances, I would have only had to change one of the objects, and then all of them would have updated automatically. So you want to be thinking as you're working on big projects, if I'm having many things, are they going to be exactly the same thing? Or I might want to be changing them all at once. Now, there's also the ability, if I select a particular object, and where is it, to make it unique. So I can come over here in the stack, and I can choose Make Unique. And now I've made that unique. And so then I can go to that object and I can change its height, and I can change its twist, and it has lost that that link to the other objects. There are some scripts out there that will do the reverse, that will make an object that will reassign that. I haven't used those. You can find them on Soulburn by Neil Blevins. Actually, if I went to the internet right now, maybe I'd show that to you, but I think I'm going to hold off on that. We have That would be a bit of a digression. Okay, so we have just now looked at, let's just review what we've seen so far. We've looked at primitive objects, how to make those primitive objects, how to access the primitive objects parameters when you're making them, and also how to access them later on. We've looked at the modifier stack as a method to go up and down and to make adjustments. We've looked at animating those values. We've looked at doing moving objects, select, rotate, and scale, and clones, references, and instances. Now, one other thing that relates to this, I'm going to reset for a second. And that is that a lot of times you really do need to be precise in Max. And one of the ways that we do precision is with snaps. So on the main toolbar, we'll find there's a snaps toggle. And if I press there, there's a 2D snap, a 2.5D snap, and a 3D snap. In addition to that, there is an angle snap, a percent snap, a spinner snap. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but I'm going to show you some of the things about snaps that are that I use. So one of the simple things that I do is I go to Tools, Grids and Snaps, Grid and Snap Settings. And in Grid and Snap Settings, you'll see these are the standard options for snaps. And we have the choice of snapping to grid points, pivot, perpendicular, vertex, edge segment, faces, grid lines, bounding box, tangent, endpoint, midpoint, center face. If any of you have had any background in CAD software, you'll find these will be familiar. They're stolen directly from AutoCAD. In the distance, there are body snaps for body objects and NURB snaps. And I'm not going to deal with NURBs in this class, but for standard snaps, if I have the default is to be set to grid points. So now if I turn on snaps, and S on the keyboard is the shortcut to turn on the snaps, now I can click and drag, and you'll see it very easily I snap to points on the grid. The other kind of snap that I use, also a right click on this will also bring that up, is I'll turn off grid snaps and I'll snap to vertex. So this is something that not many people know that Max operates like this, and it's really, really useful. If I say I want to snap to vertices, then I can choose the move tool, and now I can move this and snap it right to there. I could move this guy and I could snap it right to there. So this allows you to build and assemble objects in a very powerful way. Let's say I want to move this one, snap it, I have it snapped set, say okay, and now I'm going to move it. What's going on here? There we go. Okay, got it. Snapped it right to there. There are other options for the snap in terms of how close you need to get for the snap to actually operate, the size of the marker. So these are important. Now, one other snap that I use with great frequency is the angle snap. So I'm going to show you how I might make something with an angle snap. So let's suppose I make a box like that, and then this box is then going to be like, let's say it's going to be the spokes on a wheel. Now I have to do some math, which I'm probably not going to enjoy doing, but in any case, what I could do is I could turn on angle snap and then set my angle snap on. A on the keyboard turns it on or off. Now I'm going to rotate this object, hold down the shift key. I'm going to say I want to rotate that, let's say 20 degrees. And now I'll make this an instance. And I'm going to say I would like to have, let's try 12 of these and say, okay. Okay, now I can go back and go, okay, that wasn't right. Let's say 30 degrees. And we'll try 12 of those and say, okay, there we go. Now we have a wheel. So in the video game that I did where I had to do a train, a simple example of, let's get rid of all this, would be the train tracks. So I would make just to do this, I'll make one of those. I'll go here, hold down the Shift key, make the second one. This will be an instance. I'll call this rail. Actually, what would it be? It would be track. Rename this one to be track. Notice something that Max does, which some people like and some people don't like, is that it doesn't require every object to have a unique name. It's not a good thing to do, not a good practice to do. It'd be smarter to call this track left, track right. Now I'll use the auto grid, and I'm going to zoom in here. I'm making this just small like this, but now I'll change its parameters. I made it small just so that it would be in the right place. And I'll pick this up and I'll move it just in one axis, like that. Maybe you can see I'm really an artist, not a designer. So I'm not really thinking about the size. Notice when I change the length that it's coming out of the middle of it. This is what I said was driving me crazy sometimes. If I use a cylinder, it comes off of one end. But so now I have to sort of shift this around till I get it around where I want it. And I'm a visually oriented person, so I want it to be a different color. And now I'll set this over here. And if I really knew what I was doing, Control Z, I think I, hold on, Control Z, zoom back a little bit, make sure I get this right. Okay, now I'll just say I want to move it that distance. If I was smart, I'd be using a snap to get it exactly the distance that I want. But in any case, I can look down at the down here and see what I used, and then I can say I would like there to be 20 of these and say okay, and boom, that's how I make the tracks for my train. Okay, so I think that's about it on snaps. And I think that at this point, I'm going to show you something that is going to be a little bit, I'm a little bit at odds about showing you this soon. So maybe I will hold off on it and go into a bit more in terms of other modeling things. Open up this file and take a second here. Train 02, changes no. I think I will show you this, even though this is totally out of place. But I think that it would be good for you guys to understand how to do this. And it's just going to load. Give it a minute to load. Anything that you want to model, the best way to start modeling is to have a continue. Is to start with some reference photographs. So I want to show you how you actually build a reference photo or map a reference photo onto a plane so that then when you go and do your own modeling, you'll be able to do like I've done here and have a reference plane for you to work from. So this takes us to the material editor, and I just want to see where that that train image is. Hang on one second, and I'm going to go and grab it, and I'm going to come over here. Okay, level 13. We're gonna have to see if I can find this image. If I'm pretty sure I put this in a 3D Buzz directory. So if not, we'll fake it. So I'm gonna reset. So this is kind of an aside. This is just sort of like if you guys want to start actually modeling something this week, this is how you would do it. So I'm going to start in the front view. I'm going to go grab my, I'm going to start by making a material. To make a material, I go into the rendering menu and I choose material editor. Now there's two material editors in Max now. I'm going to use the old one, which is called the compact material editor, because that's what I learned for the past 20 years. And in this particular file, I'm going to go and select one of these, and I'm going to change to a standard material. Standard material. So under materials, I choose standard, and I choose standard again. I say OK, and there's that material. I'm going to give it a color, and I'm going to make a plane over here, and I'm going to assign that material to the plane. Now, next to the diffuse, there's a button, and I click on it, and that lets me go to the material map browser, and I choose maps, and I choose bitmap. As soon as I click that, this highlights, and I say OK. And now it takes me to wherever I might have bitmaps placed. Now let's just see if I can find under 3D Buzz. No, I didn't put any bitmaps in there. So I just have to think for a minute really quick, which is that I know it's under level 13, which is under desktop backup. Desktop backup, level 13. And I'm pretty sure that my file is right here. There it is. Okay. Now here's one thing that's really important right now. So any picture that you want, go find yourself a picture, take a photograph of something. In this case, I'm working with just one photograph, but really you usually are going to use multiple views of something. So I'm going to use the one photograph, and I'm going to go over here and look, and I'm going to say, this is 778 by 276. So that's the size of that picture. I'll say OK. And then if I come back here, before I put it on the object, I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to make this object the same kind of resolution. 77.8 tab, 27.6 tab. So that should give me the same resolution as that picture. So now, if I actually drag that onto here, and then click on Show Material in Bit there, we have another problem going on here. What's that problem? I'm going to have to add a UV map. What have I done wrong? UV map. I'm going to turn off real world scale. I'm going to turn off real world scale over here. And at the plane, I'm going to turn off real world scale. And don't know what I've done wrong. Bear with me for a moment here. Let's view the image. Okay, there it is. Should be coming up just right. Plane. Let's add some segments to it. No, that's not doing it. Let's get rid of that. Let's put it on a box and see if that fixes it. Why I'm getting this issue here. Over here, put this object onto there. Turn off real world scale. Okay, it had something to do with the way I made the plane. So I'll use that box instead, and I will adjust the values of that box. What did we say? 77.8, and the tab key, the width will be 27.6, tab key, and the height, oops, okay, Control Z, 27.6, and the width will be 0. There we go. And then one other thing that we're going to do is we're going to come back to, in the material editor, this button that says go to parent and turn on self-illumination. Set that to 100%. Oh, that didn't like that. Better set this color down to 0. Say OK. There we go. So by creating a reference plane like this, you then have a template that you can use to make your work. So now what I might do is there's one other really important thing, which is that I don't want to affect this object again. I would like this object, one thing I want to do is I'm going to move it so that it's not right at the center, because I'll probably be making things at the center. So I'm going to move it off of here, and then I'm going to say, I don't want to be able to touch this object and affect it. I want it to just be here as a reference plane. So what I'll do is I'll right click and I will choose freeze selection. Now, if I do that, I'm going to find a problem. Maybe. Let's see, it's selected. Freeze selection. Yeah. So the problem is the picture's gone away. Unfreeze all. So instead, I need to select the object and go to Object Properties. And now the display properties, I have to change so that it's by object. And then I have to choose that it is Show Frozen in Gray. I have to turn that off. Now I can go ahead and I can freeze that object and say OK. And now this is frozen. Frozen means that I can't pick it. I can't select it. I can't move it. I can't do anything to it. So now I'm going to get rid of that object. So now if I want, I could start over here and I could say, OK, let's suppose I'm going to start by making a cylinder over here. Oops, I want to make the cylinder in the front view. Out like that. Now I'll come over to a, let's take our left view and make it realistic. Let's zoom in on it here. And say, OK, let's start to move this into place. Let's make that cylinder a little bit longer. Let's see, it's going to start about there. Make that cylinder a little longer, like about like that. Okay, now we need some sort of a sphere off the end of that. I'll choose sphere, auto grid. Maybe I'll zoom in here. And I got sphere, I got auto grid. I'm going to start here and I'm going to make my sphere coming off of like that. I'm going to make that sphere a hemisphere. And then I'll move that back about there. I'm going to take that sphere and I'm going to increase its radius. I get it. Now, if I was a designer, I would know exactly what I wanted to do there. So there I'm getting that. Maybe I'll make another sphere now in the top view. I'm sorry, a cylinder in the top view. Is Snap-on? I wonder why it's kind of acting a little funny here. I will pick that cylinder up. Let's change its radius so it's small. Let's change its height so it's small. Let's move it up in the air. Let's align that cylinder to this cylinder. and we will align it to its X, Y position. Say, okay, whoops, should have said okay. Align, X, Y position, say okay. Now I'll move it over. And so I'm looking in the left viewport, and I could zoom in on this a little bit better. And then maybe I'll adjust the height of it down like that, adjust the radius down like that, just right about there. Look at that, okay? So you can start to see how this is a particular case where I don't have a picture of this train from different views. I found this picture of an 1877 steam engine because that's what I had to build. And I thought, oh, that's going to be good enough. And that's going to help me out. And I could continue in the same sort of vein. I could take this cylinder, I could take it, I could make a copy of it like that, and I'll make it a copy. I'll come over here. I will change its height. I will change its let's make its height like about there, and then let's increase its radius a little bit. Now I'm going to add a taper to it. And now I will put symmetry on. Let's see what happens here. There we go. There's a nice taper like that. I'll make another copy of it. And this time I'll take the gizmo and I will rotate the gizmo. And actually, first that's not working, and I don't know why it's not working. I could do different things. I could change it, like, let's not do that. Let's just rotate the object. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. Turn it around like that. Now, Control Z, A on the keyboard, so there's a snap. And now there, I've rotated 180 degrees. Move it up. Move it down like that. Now I could take the height of that cylinder and change its height. Move it down here. That's starting to approach what I'm looking for. Okay, so I was doing a little improvisation here. And the other thing that I will teach you is, as you work, whenever you start to work like this and you see something like this and you get a warm, fuzzy feeling of like, ooh, something's starting to go right. I want you to be trained like Pavlov's dog. Ooh, something's going right. I like that. You should think, oh, save. Save it. I always use save as. I never use save. Always use save as. I'm going to go save it in 3D Buzz. I'm going to call it train underscore 01 underscore primitives and save it. So that's just a little bit of a digression there. Watch the video again to understand how to make a reference plane. Next week, I'll try to dig up some files that I had which have multiple reference planes. There's other ways to work. You can work, instead of working in realistic, you could work in a wireframe. But then, or you can apply, I'm sorry, let's go back here to realistic, go to materials, and I'll make a material. Again, it's going to be a standard material. Say okay. I'll apply it to the object here, but it'll be a wireframe material. Let's give it a nice color so it's easy to see. And I'll also apply that to all these other objects. Notice that because this other object is frozen, that means that I can be sure that I won't inadvertently apply this material to the wrong object. Okay, so reference photos on planes. I was not very clear about, I went through this very fast, and I want to make sure that I go over it once again, that the steps there. I'm going to unfreeze all, and I'm going to select this object and isolate it. Alt-Q on the keyboard is the shortcut to isolate. I use that regularly as all of my my basic workflow. Alt-Q on the keyboard, move this over here, but don't click on it. Okay, so let's go over this once again. To make a reference plane, I'll use a box, and the box can have a 0 height to it. The box itself has something here that says real world map size. I like to turn that off. And then I go to the material editor. The box generates its own mapping coordinates, so you don't actually have to apply a modifier for the mapping coordinates. I go to the material editor, compact material editor. Now the default for Macs is the defaults that I have are for Arc and Design mental ray materials. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to go to the material map browser, and under materials, I'm going to open up standard, and then down here I'm going to choose standard, and I can see it changes color to show that I've selected it, and say OK. I'm going to give that just some color, just so I can see that when I drag it on to the object, that it has applied itself to the object. I'm going to go to the diffuse channel, and there's a box next to that. I can also go down to the maps rollout here and choose the map next to diffuse color. It's 2 ways to go to the same place. These are all different kinds of maps that we can use, and I'll choose bitmap and say OK. You see a glitch there. If I choose any picture that I want, I'm winging this. Duck Ride Paddle Boat 02. Now it says that it is 900 by 675. Say OK. If I apply that to the object, I don't see it until I hit this button, Show Map in Viewport. Now I'm still not seeing it very nicely because there's a difference between this, and I didn't write that down. Let me go back for a second and say, choose that. Okay, write down 900 by 675. Okay, so now that I do that, I can cancel it. Very important. Go up to, go back into here. Turn off real world scale as well there. And now this should work if this is set to, I'll say 90, tab, 67, enter. And there's that picture. Now maybe I need to reverse those. Maybe this needs to be 67 tab, and this needs to be 90 tab. There it is. So that's the method that I use to achieve this. Okay. Any questions on that? If not, there's a few other items that I would like to talk about, and then we will draw it to a close.
We did have one question.
Yeah.
At what point during this do you combine the geometry together?
Okay, well, that's actually leads right into the next thing that's on my list, which is ways to combine geometry. So let's get out of isolation mode. And in fact, I don't know if I did save it, didn't I? So let's come back here and say save your changes, say no, and we'll open up that one that I was working on right there. Okay, let's go ahead actually and hide, unfreeze all, select this guy, right click, and we'll say hide selection. Okay, so there are a number of different ways that you can put objects and have them come together. I'm going to say hold here for a second. So if I go into wireframe mode here, and let me zoom up here so you can see that this cylinder is intersecting here with the other one. If I want to, if I'm a sloppy kind of guy, and I actually am, artists tend to be sloppy. Not all artists, some artists are meticulous. I'm not that kind of artist. G on the keyboard hides my grid. Let me select all these guys and give them a black color for a minute so that now they'll look like that. That'll be nice to see. So edit, hold. There's a number of different ways I can make these objects become one object. If I want to, I can attach these objects together by using a modifier that's either called an edit poly modifier or an edit mesh modifier. The edit poly modifier is the most recent one, and that's the one I would recommend you're using for the most part. Although a lot of old school games guys will live in the edit mesh modifier, and there are a few features in edit mesh that are superior or that are frequently used. But I'll go ahead and choose edit poly. And now with edit poly in place, I can come down and say attach. And then I can say I want to attach that object. I want to attach this one and this one and this one. And now turn attach off. If I move this, it's one object now. But you'll notice that it didn't clean up the geometry. So this geometry is intersecting with the other geometry, and it's bad geometry from the point of view of clean modeling. Edit, fetch. Now, another way to join these objects together is to simply link them into a hierarchy by using the select and link tool. And you do that when you're creating objects that are going to animate, that are going to pivot. In the case of this train, I actually have a train wreck where the two trains hit and then the objects explode. So I kept the objects separate. But to link them, I click on one object, the child, and then with the link tool, select and link, I drag to the object that I want it to be linked to. So we'll link it to that one. Again, I do it and I link it to that one. This one, I link it to that one. Did it work? We'll have to check it. Trick that one and link it to that one. Now let's see if anything worked there. I didn't see it do anything. Yeah, it worked. So if I grab the parent and I move it, the other ones follow through. Link this guy to that one. So, whoops. Okay, so now if I choose the parent and I rotate it around, the other objects follow in place. But this still allows me to do things like come over here and have this object fall off. It flies off, it rotates out like this. This one rotates off, flies out like this. Come back to the original. You can see there it goes. So that's the power of using linking. Oh, and what I just demonstrated is one of the reasons that you shouldn't do what I just did. Ah, perfect. Okay, so when you use the hold and fetch keys, it's really easy to come over here and go to click fetch and inadvertently click hold and wipe out what was in the fetch buffer. And for that reason, you should train yourself to not click on these, but instead to use Control H for hold and Alt Control F for fetch. Now, fortunately, I haven't done anything really terrible here. What I will do is I will just choose unlink. Let's just select everything and unlink it. And now we're back to square one. Get back to realistic mode. And I'm going to change the color of all these objects back to something that'll be more pleasant. Okay. Okay, so the last way that I might want to attach these objects together is with something that's called a Boolean object or a compound object. Now, to do a compound object, I'm going to demonstrate this. And again, I'm going to hit hold. Go back to wireframe for a minute, so it'll be a little bit clearer what I'm going to do. Now, the thing about Boolean objects is they make messy geometry. And so from the point of view of games modeling, it's actually better not to work this way. But if you're only doing stuff for cutscenes, there are times you're going to do it. But Booleans are not the best way to work. And next class, when we get into box modeling, I'll show you alternate methods to Booleans. But if I want to attach these objects together, I select the original object, and then I choose, I go to the Create panel, and I choose Compound Objects. A compound object is an object that's made out of multiple objects. Now, the original Max Boolean has problems, and so they came up with a new one, and they called it Pro Boolean. Pro Boolean is what I'm going to use, and I'm going to make sure that I am not doing a subtraction, but I'm doing a union. Start picking, and I choose that one. And now I'll also add that one, and I'll add, I'm not sure these are intersecting, so I'm going to choose stop picking for now. And then I'm going to go back to realistic mode, zoom in here, and I'm going to make sure that these are intersecting. How could I make sure they're intersecting? How about if I use my snap tool? Snaps, and except I'm doing this in a view that's not really showing me what I'm doing. I'm living life dangerously here. Here we go, snap. So let's move like that, and I'm going to snap from this one to that one. Now those are perfectly aligned, and now what I'd like to do with it is I'm going to actually have it intersect just a little bit. And then I'll go and I'll choose this object, come back here to the Modify panel, start picking, pick that one, and now I have a Boolean object. If I go into wireframe mode, you'll now see that the excess geometry has been cleaned up using compound objects. Okay. Now there are other kinds of compound objects. There's lots of compound objects, and we'll go into those next week. The last thing that I want to do, we have about 8 minutes left until the 2 hours is up, is to just show you a little bit about organization in Max, and I'm going to reset for that. So Max has, it's a peculiar kind of a program because what has happened in the history of Max is that it was very, very widely accepted initially. And so we very quickly got a large user base of users who did not want to relearn what they knew how to do. And we didn't want to piss anybody off. When I say we, I worked for Autodesk for the development of Max from Max, for 15 years. So I feel like I'm part of the development of the program. So what happened is we would keep on adding new features, but we would never remove features. Very rarely would we remove something. So what that means is that initially we had one way to organize files, then we added another way to organize files, then we added another way to organize files, and so on. I'm going to show you 3 different ways that you could organize your files. Now, I think actually, in fact, if I go fetch, I can still do it with this. So one way to organize these is to select the objects. So let's suppose that I want to select this object, which I'm going to call smoke stack top. And then this, I'm going to call it a smoke stack funnel. And I'll call this smoke stack pipe. I will call this steam engine. And this I will call bullet nose. Excuse me 1 minute here. I have to, I've got these named, and now what I can do is I can pick different objects. Those are my 3 objects right there. And then I'm going to go and find the selection set right here. Named selection set. Click there, and I will call this smokestack. And I've just created a selection set for the 3 of those. Now, if I choose then all of those, and I will call this engine parts. Now I've created 2 different selection sets. I can choose Edit Name Selection Sets, and I click there, and this will show me that I have one selection set called Engine Parts that has those 5, a different selection set called Smokestack that has those 3 parts. This is the power of selection sets. Selection sets, an object can be in as many selection sets as you like. It's really useful. Now, an alternative method is to use layers. This button here is Manage Layers. Now, quite honestly, it's been a while since I've made layers. Right now, everything is in a single layer. So I can say I'll select that object, this object, and that object, and then I'll go Create New Layer. I'll call that layer Smokestack, and I'll click there, and those 3 objects are in Smokestack. Now, I can't have these objects be in any other layer besides Smokestack. I can take these 2 objects, create new layer, and I'll call that engine layer. And I'll say OK, and those 2 are in there. So if you want to have all the objects in your scene organized so that every object is on one and only one particular layer, then use layers. If you are coming from a design viz background, if you're importing files that come from CAD, they will come in as layers. So that's a method to use. Mostly people use layers so that they can very easily hide and or freeze large groups of objects. When I do design viz work, the first thing I do is I go through the entire file and I move everything into particular layers so that I can understand it. Actually, let me see if really fast I can get to my website, show you a couple of types of files that I'm talking about. Assuming my website is still up and running, if I go to Art, and I go to 3D Design Visualization. This is some artwork that I did for Autodesk for the covers of some of their 2008, I think. So here's an example of a file that I might get, and then I would meticulously go through each of the pieces and assign them to layers and then remove them. These kind of files have thousands and thousands of objects in place. This one's another one that's maybe 10,000 objects in the scene. All the trees would be on one layer, all the buildings would be on another layer, and so forth. Okay, the very last, with just a couple minutes to go, another method for organizing these is in something called a group. I can select all these objects. I can go to Group and choose Group. And I'll call this Engine Parts and say OK. When they're in a group, then they move as one. And the added attraction is that in the select by name, select from scene dialog box, I don't see the individual objects. So we group objects like this when we have a tremendous number of objects in the scene and we want to have a list that we can pick from that is simple to work from. So that's grouping. Now, the way grouping works is that if I want to, I'm just going to make another object here. It doesn't make any sense, but I'm just going to make it. If I want to add that to the group, then I can choose Attach, click on it, and now that object is now in that group. If I want to make changes, I can open the group, and then I can pick that object, and I can move it over. And then if I close the group, it's back in the group. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. I think that's probably enough for today. The next class that we're going to do is we're going to be looking at making 3D. Next class is really probably the most fun of anything because we're really going to get into serious modeling. So modeling 3D objects from 2D by drawing lines, using modifiers like Lathe, Extrude, Bevel, and then box modeling, how to make virtually anything that you want by pushing and pulling vertices, edges, and polygons. So as far as homework goes for this week, I would like you to start thinking about something that you would like to model and look for a reference photo. If you don't want to do that, you're welcome to skip the homework and go find a train. I'm going to try to keep working on the train as much as I can throughout the class, but I don't require you to make a train. If you want to make something else, then go find some reference materials and see if you can put them on a box and get them ready for work, for modeling. I would also like you to play with the primitive objects and AutoGrid and just play around with that and get comfortable with that. Are there any more questions, Nelson?
It doesn't seem like. Let me. Yeah, I don't see any questions. So.
All right, then that's good. We will see you guys next week.
Alrighty, we'll see everyone next week. Bye.
All right.